right. I will now reconvene the 96th meeting of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts and welcome our guests. Prior to jumping in, I would just advise everyone that our first hour was in camera, where we were hosting a delegation from Guyana as we shared best practices in terms of public accounts procedures and oversights. They are here still with us to witness one of our regular type hearings. So again, I welcome our guests and friends from Guyana. And with that, would now move to the matter at hand and would look to Monsieur Ricard, who is the Assistant Auditor General, acting on behalf of the Auditor General today. I will ask you to introduce your delegation and to read your opening remarks, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie de nous donner...
Mr. Chair, thank you for giving us the opportunity to discuss Chapter 10 of our Spring 2013 audit report, that being the advance funding of P3 Canada Fund. I have with me Mr. Cardinal, who is the principal, and Sean Odette, project director. PPP Canada is a Crown Corporation established in 2008 that administers the P3 Canada Fund. The fund provides support to infrastructure projects procured by other levels of government through public-private partnership known as P3.
Resource and borrowing levels. A Treasury Board directive prevents Crown corporations from receiving advance funding. However, PPP Canada has received yearly exemption from this directive and received funding long before its disbursements needs. As a result, the corporation has accumulated about $670 million in short-term investment as of September 2012. The audit objective was to determine whether PPP Canada funding arrangement results in financing costs to the government. We examined the amount provided to PPP Canada to fund P3 projects, when these funds were disbursed, and related financing costs. We noted that as of September 30th, 2012, PPP Canada had received $683 million of the $1.2 billion approved for the P3 fund, and had disbursed $23 million for P3 projects. We also found that the amount of advance funding it receives is expected to grow over the next 2 fiscal years. By the end of 2013-14, the corporation is expected to receive the balance of the $1.2 billion, with only $83 million of those funds likely to be disbursed by that time. In addition, in Budget 2013, the government announced that it will provide PPP Canada with an additional $1.25 billion for the P3 Canada Fund over 5 years starting in 2014-15 fiscal year.
We also found that the government did not calculate the cost of providing advance funding to PPP Canada. We estimated that advance payments to PPP Canada for the P3 Canada Fund resulted in $1.6 million in avoidable financing costs between the 2009, 2010, and 2011, 2012 fiscal years. But more importantly, the government is exposed to risk related to financing costs with the current funding arrangement of providing money to the corporation years before it is disbursed. In our view, there are approaches that would minimize the government's exposure to this risk.
In this chapter, the Department of Finance and PPP Canada agreed with our first recommendation to examine the current funding arrangement, taking into account the financing costs to the government. They committed to monitor the investment return and borrowing costs associated with the advance funding. In response to our second recommendation, the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat committed to specific actions to confirm that financing costs are taken into account in cases where Crown corporations seek an exemption from Treasury Board to get funding in advance of needs.
Your committee may wish to explore progress made to date, including the adequacy of any action plans and timelines to address the recommendations of this chapter. Mr. Chair, This concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you. Thank you.
Formally mention that this is Chapter 10, Advance Funding P3 Canada Fund of the Spring 2013 Report of the Auditor General. Now over to the Acting Assistant Deputy Minister. I'll turn the floor over to you and ask you to introduce your delegation, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for excuse me. Thank you for inviting us to speak to Chapter 10 of the Spring 2013 Report of the Auditor General of Canada. Mon nom est Richard Botham. Je suis sous-ministre.
My name is Richard Botham. I am Acting Assistant Deputy Minister, Economic Development and Corporate Finance at the Department of Finance.
And on behalf of my colleagues, Greg Smith, Vice President and Chief Financial Officer from PPP Canada, Inc., and from the Treasury Board Secretariat, Gonzague Guéranger, Executive Director for Government and Parliamentary Operations, and Sylvain Michaud, Executive Director, Government Accounting Policy and Reporting. PPP Canada, Inc. est une société d'État.
PPP Canada, Inc. is a Crown corporation that was created in 2008 and that became operational in 2009. The mandate of PPP Canada is to utilize the public-private partnerships in order to improve the delivery of public infrastructure.
Keys on P3s, provides advisory services to federal departments on their P3 projects, and delivers the P3 Canada Fund, an infrastructure contribution program that is part of the government's Building Canada plan. As indicated in the Auditor General's report, the government established PPP Canada as a non-agent of the Crown for the purpose of delivering the P3 Canada Fund. This means that commitments of the corporation are not considered binding on the Crown. In short, in order for the corporation to make credible commitments to funding partners, it must be able to demonstrate it has financial resources to back up project commitments. This is the reason why the Minister of Finance has sought and received approval from the Treasury Board on behalf of the corporation of annual exemptions from the Directive on the Use of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for Crown Corporations. Like other expenditures, funding that is advanced to PPP Canada is sourced from a mix of general government revenues and general borrowings. Associating a particular spending item, such as funding for the corporation, to a specific borrowing can only be done on a hypothetical exercise. We undertook such an analysis for the purpose of the audit. In a scenario in which all of the funds advanced to PPP Canada are sourced through borrowing, the government would meet such an uncertain and periodic requirement via the short-term debt that is being issued continuously to address variations in liquidity requirements, that is, through Treasury bills. The period covered by the audit was April 1, 2011 to September 30, 2012. We calculated the average rate on Treasury bills for 2010-11 and 2011-12 and applied such rates to amounts drawn down, which yielded hypothetical borrowing costs of $2.6 million in the first year and $4.3 million in the second. PPP Canada's return on its cash reserves was $2.2 million in the first year and $5 million in the second. The hypothetical financing costs of less than $500,000 in year 2010-11 was more than offset by a small amount of hypothetical financing surplus of less than $1 million in 2011-12. Notwithstanding this finding, given the importance of managing the advance payments with due economy, we have agreed with the recommendations in the chapter and have developed an action plan that has been submitted to this committee.
As indicated in the Departmental Action Plan, the Department is monitoring the returns that PPP Canada generates on its advanced funding and the hypothetical borrowing costs associated with the drawdowns of the appropriations for the P3 Canada Fund.
The Minister of Finance and to Treasury Board ministers when the corporation seeks an exemption to the directive, and to the Deputy Minister of Finance when the corporation seeks to draw down its appropriated funding for the purpose of the P3 Canada Fund. The Department will also advise the Deputy Minister and the Minister of any significant change in the corporation's returns or estimated hypothetical borrowing costs as appropriate. Should the Department identify significant net financing costs, the current funding model will be reviewed and recommendations will be provided to the Minister of Finance. PPP Canada will be providing assistance in the context of this process as required. In response to the Auditor General's report, the Treasury Board Secretariat, in consultation with the Department of Finance, will review the Treasury Board directive to determine whether changes needed to be made to clarify that financing costs are to be taken into account when a Crown Corporation seeks an exemption to this directive to obtain funds in advance of disbursement needs. Any necessary adjustments to the directive will be brought forward to the appropriate authority by March 31st, 2014. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We would be pleased to answer any questions that you may have regarding Chapter 10 of the Auditor General's report.
Very good. Thank you very much. Unless there's an intervention from colleagues, I will now move us to our rotational questions. And with that, Mr. Saxton, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. My first question is for the Office of the Auditor General. The scope of this audit looked primarily at the funding model of PPP Canada, which is a relatively technical issue. It didn't look at the overall value proposition of P3s. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly what we did. We didn't look at the project per se. That's what you're referring to.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. My next question is either for Finance or for P3 Canada. Why was this funding model chosen, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of this particular funding model?
Well, maybe I can start, and Greg can certainly add any details. I think the main reason why the model was chosen, and by the model, I'm referring to the fact that PPP Canada is a non-agent Crown, is that PPP Canada is undertaking projects, infrastructure projects with other partners. It does so through contributions. The projects are long-term duration, and in this case, because they are private sector managed, the view was that it was appropriate to be a non-agent of the Crown. The advantages of that, I think the main advantage is that it is making these undertakings without binding the Crown to any future liabilities which may be created as a result of the projects. Okay. It holds the Crown harmless.
Yeah, I will just add that in our case, when we execute a contractual arrangement with another level of government, say a province where there's a project, and we're committing to making a payment, say 3-4 years down the road, when I actually sign that and execute that agreement, I have to know in my mind that the corporation, PPP Canada, is able to honor that commitment down the road. And as Richard said, not being an agent of the Crown, having the cash invested in accordance with investment policies approved by Treasury Board, we know those funds are available to honor that commitment when the jurisdiction that's actually entering into the P3 arrangement and having a public asset constructed, that they will have our money to contribute to the substantial completion payment of that asset.
Okay, it was reported in the audit and also repeated today that PPP Canada, through the PPP Canada Fund, has about $670 million, or had $670 million on account in December, I think it was, of 2012. Can you explain how those funds are being invested? Do you have an oversight body? Do you have an investment officer? Is there a committee that makes a decision on where those funds are invested?
I'll answer that.
Yes.
Yes, I'll answer that. We have, there's an investment policy that's approved by Treasury Board. It lays out the types of investments we can enter into, which are very liquid. It identifies the institutions that we're able to invest in, basically banks, and we have a certain percentage that we have to maintain in provincial or federal products. It lays out the rules of the timeframes that we can invest in, and basically the rating services ratings of those institutions that we can invest in. So It's very prescriptive. That policy was established in 2008. We continue to make our investments in the market in accordance with those policies. Annually, the Auditor General audits our financial statements and makes sure that we're compliant with those authorities that we have. We report regularly to our Audit Committee and on our investments and where they are. Those are the rules under which we can invest those funds.
Okay, thank you. Can you explain how the amounts and timing of the advance funding are decided on?
I think Finance might want to answer that.
Sorry, I'm not sure the amounts of...
The amounts, because you're getting another $1.2 billion, right? You originally, I think, had close to $1 billion. And I'm just wondering, did you request those amounts, or how was it decided that those would be the amounts and the timing that you would receive those amounts?
Well, the amounts that would be drawn down by PPP Canada are identified in their corporate plan, and it's a corporate plan approved by Treasury Board according to the projects that the corporation sees that it would have in a coming year, and they make a request on that basis.
And those amounts are set out in the estimates documents that are part of the supply process and the appropriation process of Parliament. Our business was basically laid out to have various annual rounds where we open up and say we're open for business and we accept applications. And so to a certain extent they were spread out over 5 years to try and match our activity in the marketplace in accepting applications.
Okay. Sorry, time has expired. Thank you. Moving along, Madame Blanchette-Lamotte, you have the floor, ma'am.
Merci beaucoup et merci à vous tous.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being with us today. Mr. Ricard, I'd like to talk about financing costs. In the report, you evaluate that this financing costs are around $1.6 million, and your opening statement, you said that these financing costs could have been avoided between 2009, 2010, and 2011, 2012. When I look at the Department of Finance's answer, the department seems to say that there is no unequivocal proof that there is in financing costs, and I have the impression that there's a contradiction between what you evaluated as a financing cost and what the Department of Finance has found. Could you explain this discrepancy, please? Yes, as we say in the report, given that government financing, there's financing audits of government, short-term and long-term borrowing, they're not done directly by P3. When we try to establish the financing costs of PPPs, you have to borrow against. And our hypothesis of borrowing comes from the fact that PPP disperses the various amounts that government allocates. We told ourselves that the best rate to use for this would be the rates established by the government itself. So the position of the department was that no, this is short-term debt, and that means that it should be the Treasury bills rate for short-term. So there's two different working hypotheses here. We arrive at our 1.6 million costs, while the Department of Finance arrives at another. And it's because there's two working hypotheses here. We explain why our hypothesis is the right one, and given that, these are the results we come to. So if I understand correctly, the department accepts your recommendation, but disagrees with the fact that there are financing costs. Well, I think essentially, in our report, we wanted to focus on a couple of things. First of all, the fact that there's a directive that tries to prevent the use of certain revenues for certain things, and secondly, that the decision on the PPP funding, whether with one hypothesis or another, was not really done beforehand. And finally, what was important to us was to illustrate what you see in 10.3 regarding return rates and borrowing rates, whether we use one hypothesis or another, there's still a difference. And what was important for us was to indicate that there has to be some sort of monitoring of these elements so that with one model or the other, we don't end up having net financing costs, which would create additional costs for taxpayers. Okay, Mr. Botham, would you like to add something to what Mr. Ricardo said? You have used another method that didn't display any financing costs. Are you agreeing with Mr. Ricardo to continue monitoring that despite no matter what the working hypothesis is, we don't get into financing costs later on?
The way that we would approach the question of the cost of PPP Canada really starts from how the Government of Canada provides funds for particular programs. And the Government of Canada sources the funds that it provides both from its general revenues and from general borrowings. So from our perspective, that is how the government proceeds. It doesn't attach a specific borrowing instrument to a specific program, ever. That being said, we agreed with the Auditor General's recommendations that it is important to manage programs with a view to due economy, and to that extent, as you see in our action plan, we agree that this is an undertaking we will do, which is to continue to monitor and evaluate whether there are financing costs.
Vous parlez
You say, very short, okay. You commit to using different methods of financing if there are ever any higher costs of financing. What are significantly higher costs of financing? Because we already see that could there be any other financing means you were considering?
Would be invariable. The financing means are general government revenues and general borrowings. It was our view that the appropriate way of calculating a hypothetical borrowing cost is to use Treasury bills, given the nature of PPP Canada's drawdown of funds. We would continue to monitor the hypothetical borrowing costs using the methodology that we established. We think it's appropriate given the hypothetical construct that we're working within, so we would continue to do that.
Okay, thank you. Time has expired. Moving over, Mr. Cramp, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to direct a number of my questions to start to Mr. Smith. I'm basically looking for some information with regard to the investment strategies, investment responsibilities. What I would like to know to start with, I want to know who's responsible for your investment strategies. Do you have, is it an individual, a group, an agency, or do you actually have an investment board?
The organization, the PPP Canada, is responsible for that. I guess initially the governance around that it goes to our board of directors, who we report to regularly, who review our investments every quarter during an audit committee meeting. They look at the strategies and make sure that we're compliant with all of the policies that have been handed to us from Treasury Board. So it starts with them, and then there are delegations down to management that on a regular basis are going into the marketplace. And you have to understand that we can only deal with like the major financial institutions. We can only deal in bankers' acceptances or Treasury bills. So we are very limited to what we do. We make the calls around to all of the financial institutions when we have a maturity coming, and we choose the highest rate that's available for that day.
Okay, you're limited as to what you can do. Who mandates that limitation? Treasury Board or what?
That policy was established by Treasury Board.
Okay, thank you. You have significant funds held in short-term investments. If a significant part of your funding is not expected to be dispersed for several years, why are the investments still held in short-term funds?
The policy established by Treasury Board allows us to lock in a longer than 1 year term investment when we know we have a payment that's going to go on a contract when that public asset is constructed and our payment is due. If we don't have those in contractual arrangements and know when our payment's going to be due, the Treasury Board policy that we have says that we can only invest up to 1 year.
Okay, well, if I might, maybe my colleagues on the other side will permit me to a little bit of indulgence here, but that almost sounds to be pretty conservative from a point of investment potential, in that obviously when we take a look at market returns, I guess you're obviously just being very, very safe, though. That has been mandated by Treasury Board rather than taking a look at potentially some other gains that could be significant.
You would have to ask Treasury Board, but that's our view. It is a very safe investment.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt. Well, some of the other factors. I lived through that period where I both had investments and capital cost, and when the interest was, single digits. Now, I lived through that disastrous period when the interest rates went to 22%, and if you're heavily leveraged at that particular point, you have a huge, huge, huge challenge. But of course, on the investment side, it also presents other circumstances. So what I would like to know is, as the financing costs change with the interest rates rise, really, as I think it's a given. Have you planned? Are you sort of saying, well, interest rates are where they are now? It's been pretty stable for the last number of years. Looks like we're going to probably stay there for the next 5 or 10 years. Or are you anticipating, or are you prepared to be able to adjust your investment strategy, or you're locked into a particular manner that basically negates you having the flexibility to do what you need to do?
The strategy that's discussed with our audit committee is to the extent that we have investments that have to stay within it with a maturity of less than 1 year, we try to get those maturities to happen equally during the 12 months so we can be ready should there be any changes in the interest rates within the market. But that's the strategy at the audit committee, is not to anticipate what interest rates are going to do. We've been handed the rules under which we can invest, and we're just going to spread it out of the year compliant with that and make sure we have the liquidity when we need it.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe one more brief question if I have an opportunity. Thank you, Chair. I'll direct this to the Auditor General's office. I want to make sure we're talking about apples and apples, not apples and oranges here. The Department of Finance noted, of course, that the Auditor General used a different methodology to estimate net financing costs. And so maybe the Auditor General, perhaps you can tell me why you did use a different methodology than the Department of Finance.
We describe in the report the reason why we felt that the method we used was the appropriate one, and basically it's because, and I think as recognized by the department, either in the response on the reporting statement or maybe both, the borrowing at the government level is not linked to any specific payments to any specific organization. So nobody can say, well, that given dollar going there is financed short-term or long-term. So we felt the appropriate, given that, I can't claim it's short-term or long-term. We felt that the appropriate rate to use would be a weighted average of short-term and long-term borrowing tools.
Okay, fine, thank you. You picked,
No, sorry, Mr. Cramp. Nice try.
Thank you very much, Chair.
You're welcome. Moving along, over to Monsieur Giguère. You have the floor, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. Mr. Smith, you surprised me a little bit. You said at a certain point that it is important that you have enough money to fulfill your commitments. But throughout the entire history of Canada, I hear somebody say that Canada was not respecting its signature on a financial document. I thought that when the Canadian government signed a document of a financial nature, money would soon flow. So I was very surprised by what you said there. And I'll ask the question of the Department of Finance officials. In your structure, given the major demand of other governments, among them municipalities, why did you create a Crown Corporation, non-agent Crown Corporation, to deal with an infrastructure problem, even though you could have had a single wicket solution and have a non-agent Crown Corporation, and that would have removed any financing costs, and you would have had one structure that would have been much more economical, and you would have had no financing costs.
The first point is whether PPP Canada requires cash on hand, given that it is making undertakings for specific infrastructure projects. As a non-agent Crown, the commitments that it makes are not binding, so on the Government of Canada. That's the distinction between non-agent and agent, and so for that reason, they require appropriations. They need to have cash on hand so that other funding partners believe that those commitments are credible. If they were an agent Crown, that would not have the same. There would not be the same imperative. And then the second reason is goes more to the fundamental purpose of the creation of PPP Canada, as I understand it. I think at the time of the creation, the thinking was that for the Government of Canada, it was important to become a credible and active participant in the P3 market. It was important because P3 projects, not all infrastructure projects are P3 projects, but those that are possibly P3 projects can deliver better value for taxpayers. So that was the rationale. And the Government of Canada, I don't think, had extensive experience in that endeavor, and the government felt that it was important to bring to bear private sector experience in the form of a private sector board of directors to constitute a corporation to undertake what was a relatively new but very important activity. And it was for that reason that the corporation was created.
Excusez-moi, mais permettez-moi de...
Excuse me, I want to better understand what you're saying. You seem to say that PPP Canada is a Crown Corporation only in terms of its financing. In its management and its choice of investment, it functions as a private corporation. Is that what I'm understanding?
PPP Canada is a non-agent Crown Corporation for the purpose of the infrastructure projects and the management of the P3 fund.
Oui, mais si son conseil d'administration...
Yes, but if its board is composed exclusively of private sector members, if its only mandate is to finance public-private partnerships with the taxpayers' money, isn't there a risk of privatizing profits and socializing losses? Meaning if there are losses, it's the government's financial sector that'll take the blow, and if there are profits, it'll be the partnerships with the private sector that'll make the gains?
Canada is not to generate a profit for the Government of Canada. It is to enter into arrangements for P3 arrangements for infrastructure projects, which in themselves have a social good.
OK. Et à ce moment-là vient la question.
All right, well, this leads me to my relevant question. If the goal is simply to create private-public partnerships, it's very interesting from an ideological standpoint, but from an economical standpoint, what do Canadians get out of it? Because if essentially we are giving financing to private companies who otherwise wouldn't have had the ability to find the necessary capitalization in the free market, that's a little problem for me. And that problem is compounded by the fact that the economic objective is entirely excluded. What I mean by that is that American buys, buy American rather, means that you have to buy steel beams in the United States unless there is a 6% difference in price. And this kind of economic argument, does it exist in your PPP fund?
It was a long question. I have a brief response to. The last part had to do with the Buy America policy and whether there's a Buy Canadian policy in PPP Canada. Is that the question? Greg?
The P3 model, when you go in, first of all, let me clarify that our funding goes to other levels of government. So it goes to the provinces or municipalities that we give the money. They are the ones that actually procure the public asset that they need to provide services to their citizens, and they own those assets. So the ultimate assets that are procured through a P3 model remain ownership in the public sector, not the federal government, but who we're giving the money to, provinces or territories. One of the fundamental principles of the P3 is that there is competitive tension in the procurement process, and so the more and the better bidders that you have on that will drive the value. So where they come from, there are consortia that are bidding on P3s in Canada from all over the world.
Okay, that's good. We're going to have to end it there. We're way over on time. Thank you. Moving along, Mr. Hayes, you have the floor, sir.
Chair, most of these questions are going to be directed to the Deputy or AG, Mr. Ricard. In your report, Section 1017, it was nice to see you actually gave some recommendations in terms of an approach to minimizing government exposure to financing costs. And you gave 3 recommendations. I won't repeat them verbatim, but there was a response given to the bottom 2 recommendations, the one being the corporation status could be changed from a non-agent to an agent, and the other one, the corporation could deposit its advance funding in the consolidated revenue account. And those, I guess, were rejected in 2009. And the arguments given were that PPP Canada, the Department of Finance, and the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat considered the last 2 possibilities. According to government officials, these potential solutions were rejected because they were unduly complex and administratively burdensome, or they were inconsistent with government decisions regarding the status of the corporation as a non-agent of the Crown. So I guess my first question is do you accept those arguments? And if you don't, how would one go about changing those? I would think it would have to be legislative change. That's my first question. The second question is your first recommendation, which is the one that, quite frankly, intrigues me. And if I had to pick one of the 3, this would be the one I would pick. So you guys get ready, because I'm going to be asking you the next question on the first one. The corporation could obtain a written guarantee from the government that the P3 funding is available upon request closer to the time of the corporation's disbursements. That sounds really logical to me. So, Mr. Ricard, I think I've been clear in my question.
Yeah, I think I understand your question. Maybe just one point to clarify. Paragraph 17 is not quite a recommendation. It's a list of example of other models that could be used. And we're signaling in paragraph 18 that the last 2 were somewhat considered at the time by when the organization was set up. Now, your question is, do we buy, I think that's the wording the words you use,
do you
the
agree?
argument. I guess by the simple fact that we put them here, not really, but I mean, one would have to have further discussion with the organization and see to what extent and what considerations were looked into when they were decided one or the other. Back to one point I mentioned earlier is the fact that when the decisions were made back then, the financing cost was not considered. So to an extent, the financing cost brought back into the picture may influence the decision. So I don't know if I'm answering your question there.
Yeah, indirectly. So let's step back to the first one, your first approach. I would prefer, and I've had this conversation with Mr. Ferguson before, that for us to, and for departments to gain the greatest value from the Auditor General's department, recommendations are nice in terms of how to do things, because when you have a staff of 550 experts, and it's nice that you can identify approaches, but again, I'd prefer to see recommendations. So that being said, your first approach, the corporation could obtain a written guarantee. I think that's a great idea. Can you comment on why you gave that as an approach? And then I'm going to go to Mr. Botham and ask him to comment on that approach.
Maybe back to the first part of the question and closing on your those are three examples that for us are models that could be considered. Yes, the first one makes lots of sense, but for us, the three of them make lots of sense. And maybe to try to explain why there is a list and we're saying those are examples, and maybe there's others, is at the end of the day, we're trying to be respectful of the fact that the policy decision about a given model or another one doesn't belong to us. We're saying, though, please do consider financing costs when you make that decision. So that's why we left it at examples of scenarios or models.
Okay. That being said, I'm going to come back to you in 1 second, Mr. Botham. Then my question to you, Mr. Ricard, is are you recommending a certain optimal level of financing costs that is appropriate, or are you suggesting that there should be no financing costs whatsoever?
I suppose having absolutely no financing costs is close to impossible, I suppose, but again, one would have to look at various models. And the reason for that is at some point there's a need, given the model in place right now with the Crown Corp, they need the money at some point in their bank account to be able to pay the projects. Our message is please don't give that money too much ahead of time, especially considering the directive that is in place that prevents such advance to Crown Corporation is exactly for the reason of reducing impact on borrowing levels of the government.
Okay, I'm sorry, time's expired, and time is rapidly running out. Thanks, Mr. Hayes. Colleagues, I just want to point out that given the time that's remaining, and given the fact that I need this committee to make one quick decision about next week that shouldn't be controversial, we can do 2 more rounds. I would ask you to keep them to 4 minutes so we can get under our time frame. That would have meant, for those checking, that would have meant 4 government questions, 2 official opposition, and 1 from the third party. So pretty close to a balance if you think about our normal rotation is 2 hours, and we had to artificially chop it in half. So with your support, that's what we'll do. 2 more speakers, 4 minutes each. Mr. Byrne, you have the floor, sir.
How long do I have?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Parliament has appropriated to 3P Canada a certain amount of funds. I understand it to be $1.2 million. Over what period of time?
It's over five fiscal years.
Beginning in 2009.
Yes.
Would you be able to inform the committee your forecast for the disbursement of funds in this fiscal year, next fiscal year, and the year after?
Yes, in fact, you will. We disclose that in our annual report, which we're just in the final stages of completing our audit, finalizing our audit report. But in the management discussion and analysis of our annual report, you'll see the projects and the expected cash flows.
And you cannot inform this committee at this point in time what this is?
Yep. Yes.
What is it?
How much?
What is your forecasting for each fiscal year in disbursements to projects?
Perhaps you can go to your next question. I'll just find my notes on that one.
I'm assuming that it's probably not $683 million. Would that be correct?
It's actually significant.
Well, then, since my time is limited, I'll let you get that information, and I'll move to Mr. Botham. Assuming it's not quite $683 million, Mr. Botham, it would be possible to defer disbursements to 3P Canada through the Budget Implementation Act to actually extend the period of time from 5 years to, say, 7. It would provide a guarantee, a statutory guarantee that 3P Canada would indeed receive a certain amount of funds in which they could negotiate partnership projects with clients or partners. Why wasn't that done? Given the fact that we are now in a situation where this nation is borrowing money to pay for its annual expenditures, why wouldn't we, if 3P Canada is not spending the money that it has coming into it as appropriated for it by Parliament, and assuming Mr. Smith might be able to give me an answer soon that says it's less than 683 million, which it currently has in accounts, why wouldn't we simply allow that money to be used to offset deficit requirements and extend the period of time in which Parliament appropriates or disperses to 3P Canada for an additional 2 years? Seems like that would be the best way to minimize financing costs.
Well, I think it goes back to the initial premise, which is for P3 Canada to enter into agreements with its provincial, territorial, municipal partners for projects, it requires cash on hand. If the government were to limit the appropriations, P3 Canada would not be able to make those projects.
But that's exactly my point. They have the cash on hand, so they've got a certain amount, and if there was a statutory guarantee through a budgetary, through a budget, an appropriation act, that they were going to get the full $1.2 billion, I'm not quite reading as to, maybe there's a sensitivity or a nuance here that I'm just not getting. They're not entering into something to which they could not contractually, adhere to, and we could actually defer payments to them, which would eliminate borrowing costs or financing costs, and they could still meet their timelines. Mr. Smith, if you want to jump in, if you do have that information, but in the meantime, Mr. Botham.
13-14 will be $14 million.
$14 million.
And 14-15, $55 million. 15-16, $40 million. 16-17, $80 million. And in 17-18 and thereafter, we have commitments now for $505 million.
Okay, I'm sorry. I really am sorry, but time has expired. I must move along to Mr. Shipley, and I know, sir, you offered to truncate yours because of the time. I do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and in due time, I just really will have a question because it's following up a little bit. When you're taking and you're securing significant amounts of money, and I don't think this one's been touched on, but I'm sort of curious. When you look at where you're going to get it, are there specific credit ratings that you look at in terms of security, in terms of where you get the money from?
As set out in the Treasury Board policy that we have to adhere to, we're told where we can invest, what the ratings of those institutions are, and what the products are that we can invest in, and the time frames.
Have those changed since the initiation of the P3s?
No, those were approved in 2008 at the inception of PPP Canada, and they still exist.
And has that ever been an issue in terms of the financing that you secure?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very good. Thank you, Bev. I appreciate your cooperation and assistance. All right, colleagues, that brings us to a close of this meeting. So 3 quick things. First of all, thank you to our witnesses, our guests, but also to advise you that the committee will reserve the right to determine whether we will have the second half of this meeting or whether the committee feels that 1 hour was good for this chapter. It won't be Tuesday that you're called back, but beyond that, be on standby. And if the committee, when and if the committee makes its decision, you'll be notified right away. So hopefully, if we do need you back, we can make that happen. But thank you very much for coming today and answering the questions. We appreciate it. Second, colleagues, next week, we have nothing on the work plan right now. However, we had a report writing day that we lost because of voting. So I would suggest, and especially given where we are in the cycle and the uncertainty, that we just notionally plan for at least report writing on Tuesday, possibly even Thursday also if we're still here. And during those meetings, we will have the option to make a determination about a continuation of this hearing or not. When the committee wishes, we can be seized of that. Unless there are any other further matters to come before the committee, and I'm seeing none, the last thing I want to do is to again thank our guests from Guyana. It's been an honor having you here. We were pleased to host you. I think we had a very productive session early on, and we look forward to continuing engagement and continuing improvement in our oversight capacities, and we wish you a safe journey home. With that, colleagues and guests, this committee now stands adjourned.